Hey everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Jim Platte, who's come all the way from Alabama just to speak to you tonight. I'm not joking, that's true. Jim is an assistant professor with the U.S. Air Force Center for Unconventional Weapons Studies at the Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where his teaching and research interests focus on U.S. nuclear deterrence and counterproliferation policies. Prior to starting at CUWS in February of 2017, he was an intelligence research specialist with the U.S. Department of Energy. He conducted research on civil nuclear issues in East Asia as a 2015 Asia Studies visiting fellow at the East-West Center in Washington, D.C., was a Sasaki Peace Foundation fellow in 2014 at Pacific Forum in Honolulu, Hawaii, and in 2012 he was with the Council of Foreign Relations as an International Affairs Fellow in Japan. And James was telling me that earlier in his career he also had a period of time at the Los Alamos labs. He completed his PhD in International Relations at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was the Stanton Nuclear Security Pre-Doctoral Fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfair Center for Science and International Affairs. He has experience working on nuclear proliferation issues with the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control. He holds a MS and a BS in Nuclear Engineering from the University of Michigan, and an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs. You could hardly believe that a person with this kind of resume and accomplishment is apparently 30 years old, so it's really quite impressive. And Jim gave a lecture to my class earlier today in the afternoon, and I think Jim is a genuine authority on these issues, and I look forward to hearing it. So let's welcome Jim.
Well, thank you, Kyle, for the very kind introduction. It sounds like I can't hold down a job, but yeah, I'm really glad to be here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Tokyo. Spent some really good time here. I've known Robert for a while, known Kyle for a while, so it's really a pleasure to come and speak to their organization. I do want to start. Kyle said I came all the way from Alabama. For the non-Americans here, do y'all know where Alabama is? No, we can talk about the election later. I need a break from it. But yeah, Alabama, deep south, a little bit different setting than Tokyo. But anyway, glad to be here. So today I'm going to talk about a project that a colleague at the Air War College and I are working on. Basically looking at how can we view and analyze North Korean nuclear strategy. And, you know, North Korea's nuclear program is not new. It's decades old. You could say it really started in earnest in the 1980s, but its roots go before that. But I would say there's a significant difference in what North Korea was doing simply to acquire the capability, and now that they have what appears to be a functioning nuclear arsenal, how are they going to posture and use these weapons? And when I say use, I don't necessarily mean using in combat or using in violence, but simply by how they posture, how they talk about them, how they present it to the region and the world will show how they intend to use this in diplomacy and generally in their own security affairs. And I think, as a little preview of what's to come, I think North Korea, the way that they will posture, could be different than what we've seen other nuclear states do. So, but of course, I would be remiss if I didn't have this, since I am a U.S. government employee. Everything I say here today is my own opinion and do not necessarily represent the views of Air University, the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or any other U.S. government agency. So this is all me. Anything I say that's crazy or wrong is my fault and not the U.S. government's fault. So first I'm going to start with looking at some of the existing research on nuclear strategy, and then maybe how we could apply that research to North Korea, and maybe where North Korea diverges or is different. And then some of the theoretical implications for what does this mean for how we analyze nuclear strategy. Look a bit at some of the domestic debates within Japan and South Korea on how to address this threat. And then finally, some policy implications, but what my hope is there is that since this is, I think it's a relatively new situation now that we're in. So instead of me just kind of babbling about what we could do, I'd like to have a discussion with everyone here about how do we, in America, in Japan, in Korea, how do we approach this issue? And so this, again, the project we're working on, sort of looking at now North Korean behavior, say in its past versus now that it has the weapons. Maybe how could North Korea change or not change? It could have some continuity with its previous strategic goals. And depending on the type of nuclear posture they adopt, what does that say about what they are trying to achieve with their nuclear weapons? And then finally, of course, I work for the US Air Force, so what they really care about is what should we do? All this theory stuff is nice, but tell us what we should do. So let me first kind of go into some background on existing literature on nuclear strategy. Now, if you go way back to the beginning of the nuclear era, up to about the year 2000, almost all of the literature on nuclear strategy was focused on the US and the Soviet Union, or now Russia. Those two states sort of defined how we view nuclear strategy and nuclear posture. But those two states may be very different than every other state that possesses nuclear weapons. Those two states have an order of magnitude more nuclear weapons than any other state. They have extended deterrent commitments that other nuclear states do not have. And they maybe have global strategies, whereas the other nuclear states might have more regional strategies. So I think it's worthwhile then to look at some of the burgeoning literature on how do regional or smaller nuclear powers behave, rather than trying to force views of US or Russian nuclear strategy on the regional nuclear powers. So some scholars say over the last 5 years, I think there's been a new effort to first go back to the Cold War and try to understand what was the US and the Soviet Union doing. But more relevant for us here is some of the literature coming out on how are nuclear weapons used, not just as a tool of deterrence, but potentially as a tool of coercion. And I'll get into what the difference could be in those. And then also, Vipin Narang has been a very prominent scholar from MIT, writing on postures of the regional nuclear powers. And I'll get into a little bit more, particularly of Narang and the Sexer and Furman. So Vipin Narang, this is quite a prominent book that came out a few years ago, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era. And Narang goes through and looks at what he calls regional nuclear powers, independent regional nuclear powers. So he does not cover the United Kingdom, but he goes through nuclear posturing for China, India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa, and I'm forgetting one. It'll come to me. France, dang it. So these 6 nuclear states, and looking at how they are different than the 2 superpowers. And he develops what he calls a posture optimization theory. And then through this posture optimization theory, identifies 3 nuclear postures that these 6 states have adopted, and a typology for those postures and a way to analyze them. So he has kind of a flow chart of determinative factors that will decide what a country will do to optimize its nuclear posture. The first posture that Narang identifies, the catalytic posture, and he categorizes Israel, South Africa, and Pakistan early in its nuclear days under this. This posture basically, a country maintains a bit of a latent nuclear capability and signals to an ally or what it views as maybe a protectorate state that in a conflict, if that state doesn't step in, that the regional power will operationalize its nuclear weapons and use them. So say South Africa was expecting the United States to step in on its behalf, and if the US didn't, it would then operationalize its nuclear weapons. So in this sense, it was using its own nukes to try and catalyze US intervention in a potential conflict. And Narang says the same for Israel. The next one, assured retaliation, is basically just a second strike capability, that a state postures solely to be able to absorb a nuclear blow and be assured in being able to retaliate with nuclear weapons. So in this sense, this posture is really only deterring nuclear attack, not conventional attack. China and India are the two prominent examples that Narang has in his book for this, that they don't intend to use nuclear weapons in conventional conflict, but only if it goes nuclear. But thus, by having an assured retaliation, no country would do a first nuclear strike on it. The third posture that Narang identifies is called asymmetric escalation. This is the most aggressive or forward-leaning posture, in that a country early in a conventional conflict threatens to use nuclear weapons to end that conflict by threatening the use of nuclear weapons or even using them, that afterward they would immediately sue for peace to end the conflict and return to status quo. So I'll get into a little bit of maybe look at Narang's typology and analysis and see if we can fit North Korea in there. Narang himself did do this in an article he wrote after the book, putting North Korea in the catalytic category. But I think there are some issues with that, and I will discuss that later. But in general, when looking at Narang's model, and Narang is really the first scholar to try and create a typology and framework for understanding regional nuclear powers. He creates a very parsimonious theory. It's a difficult word to say, but it's very simple. States optimize their nuclear posture to achieve their strategic goals. Okay, that's simple. But at its beginning, it assumes that every state is simply trying to deter with its nuclear weapons. But we know from very early scholars, particularly Thomas Schelling, that a state can use nuclear weapons for other means than deterrence. Obviously, it can be used in combat, but they can also be used for what Schelling termed as compellence. Compellence is kind of a word that Schelling made up, but he's a Nobel laureate, so he can do that. That's fine. I'm not allowed to do that yet. I just have to use words other people made. But compellence, a more popular parlance for it is coercion. Schelling says under coercion there's compellence or deterrence. But I think in popular parlance people say coercion or deterrence. But I'll use Schelling's words. So the difference being that in deterrence, the deterring state is trying to prevent an action from being taken, to influence the decision-making of the adversary, that the adversary will not take an action. Compellence is sort of the opposite, where you try to influence the adversary to take an action. And taking an action can include stopping an action. So try and compel stopping of a military campaign, stopping of alliance activities, or you try to compel them to do something, restore a leader to power, whatnot. These are pretty common methods used generally in diplomacy and security affairs. But the use of nuclear weapons in coercion or in compellence has been a topic of some discussion recently, and how effective nuclear weapons are at this. This is a recent book, just came out this year, Nuclear Weapons and Coercive Diplomacy, by Todd Sexer and Matt Furman. And they try to analyze this. Can nuclear weapons be used for compellence? And if so, how effective are they at doing that? Now, they really start out in their theory by saying deterrent threats can be credible because simple state survival is at stake. And this goes back to the beginning of thoughts on nuclear deterrence, from Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, Thomas Schelling, all saying that a Soviet nuclear attack on the US homeland will make it very credible for the US to say we would respond with nuclear weapons. And I don't think the Soviets or others would be willing to disregard this. They would say, well, of course, a nuclear attack on your homeland, and you say you would respond with nuclear weapons, that seems believable, seems credible. Most compellant cases, according to these authors, are not at that level. State survival is not at stake. So nuclear threats made in compellence are thus incredible. That the adversary would think you would never use nuclear weapons in this situation because it's not worth it to you. Your survival is not at stake. And there's a whole nuclear taboo that has developed over the last 70 years. Why would you risk that taboo? Or if you're trying to compel another nuclear state, why would you risk a nuclear response on your own state? Again, for something that is probably not about survival of your state. Now in this, I start to get to thinking, maybe North Korea thinks its survival is at stake. So maybe compellent threats from North Korea could be credible. But Sexer and Furman do an analysis of compellent threats made by nuclear states in history. Not always threats in a nuclear standoff, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but just in general. Can a state with nuclear weapons basically have its way in the world? Push others around, do whatever it's want? Through really an in-depth statistical study and then some deep dives in qualitative studies, they conclude that nuclear weapons have not been useful for compellence. That nuclear-armed states are no better at compellence than non-nuclear states. And in fact, they might not be as good as the non-nuclear states. So maybe North Korea is not trying to compel, because maybe it's just not credible. But one thing they point out, there's really not cases of states that are postured to compel. That what we have seen is states postured to use their nuclear weapons for deterrence and use other instruments of power for compellence. So now if we think, what would a compellent posture look like? We kind of know what deterrent postures look like. Attempting to maintain a status quo. You're attempting, again, for inaction. You want your adversary not to do something. You generally want to maintain status quo, maintain whatever the current order is. Good deterrence relationships can be inherently stable in that sense. Neither side takes aggressive action against the other, and status quo is maintained. A compellent posture is the opposite. The state is trying to revise something, trying to change the status quo. So through this can be much more aggressive posturing. They try to create some sort of bargaining advantage through the use of compellent threats. And one thing about compellent threats is that unless they are acted on, their credibility degrades over time. So the US can make a pretty credible deterrent threat over time, saying any attack on the US mainland will prompt a nuclear response. That seems pretty credible. We don't have to just randomly nuke some country to make that threat be credible. Any sort of compellent threat, be it nuclear or not, at some point does require action, does require that state to act on it, otherwise the credibility degrades. So this would make a compellent posture just inherently more aggressive in order to be effective. And so a state that would posture its nuclear weapons for compellence becomes a bit more destabilizing than a deterrent posture. But first, I want to go back to Narang and try and think through his framework and his typology to see if we can fit North Korea into one of his deterrent postures. Narang uses several factors. One of them is simply capability. And I'll show his flow chart and go through it. But what sort of capabilities does a state have, be it long-range ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, tactical weapons for use on the battlefield, that these can be indicative of what type of posture a state has. And Narang also says that his categories are empirically exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So this means any regional state with nuclear weapons, Narang claims, is in his categories. So let's see where North Korea can fit. I apologize, this is probably too small for many of you to read, but I will go through it. So he first starts these regional nuclear powers. He asks for the availability of a third-party patron. So say this for Israel, this was the United States. For South Africa, it was also the United States. And he says if there's this third-party patron available that the regional nuclear power believes that they can convince to intervene in a conflict, that state will go for a catalytic posture. Again, meaning the deterrent signals actually go to the patron to try and convince them to intervene in the conflict. If there's no third-party patron available, then we go down this flow chart here. But let's think about this for a second. Does North Korea have a third-party patron available? The only possible one seems to be China. And Narang himself, when trying to do a first take at North Korea a couple years ago, was yes, China appears to be the catalyst. Not because China's an ally or good buddy of North Korea. I don't think China or North Korea view each other as super good friends. And Kim Jong-un has not been very warm toward China. And I think the feeling has been mutual from Xi Jinping. But China does have an interest in a stable region. And so they may intervene in a conflict in Korea simply to get it to stop, and return to status quo, and return to stability in the region. But I'm not convinced that that's what North Korea wants. That North Korea wants to catalyze China's intervention in a conflict on the peninsula. So if we say no, then we start going down his flow chart here. The next question is there a conventionally superior proximate offensive threat? Well, for North Korea, certainly. US and South Korean combined forces seem superior. Seemingly all wargaming suggests that the US and South Korea combined forces would win in a conventional battle with North Korea. So Narang's flowchart would suggest that North Korea adopts asymmetric escalation. And I think there's something to that. That North Korea could think that it needs to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict to terminate it. But this also suggests North Korea wants the conflict end and a return to status quo. I don't know if it used nuclear weapons first, if we're just going back to status quo afterward. If we go further down, he has other intervening factors such as civil-military arrangements, resource constraints, that would determine whether or not the state goes for asymmetric escalation or assured retaliation. Now, an interesting thing about trying to put North Korea in that asymmetric escalation category is Narang says that those states will make tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical meaning that they are deployed to the front lines and front field officers are given launch authority, not necessarily the president. Because if you need to have a quick decision that we need to use nukes now to end this conflict, that field commander needs authority to do that. Given party military relations in North Korea, I'm not sure that Kim Jong-un or the Workers' Party would be willing to give its frontline commanders that sort of authority. Also, North Korea does not have tactical nuclear weapons. Their systems are for ballistic missiles. They're trying to develop a submarine launch. They seem very close to an intercontinental range ballistic missile. They already have the medium and short range. They don't have battlefield weapons, like landmines or nuclear artillery. Which is kind of interesting if they're trying to deliver a nuclear weapon to Seoul. Seoul is within artillery range from the border. But I've seen no indication that North Korea is developing any sort of nuclear artillery to give to its frontline forces. So I don't, now its ballistic missiles could be an assured retaliation, and certainly mobile launchers for its ballistic missiles, for its land-based ones, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles are indicative of an assured retaliation. These are safe, they can be moved so that they can guarantee a second strike. But in this, the assured retaliation also means that the state absorbs a nuclear blow first and then responds. I again would question whether North Korea thinks it can absorb a nuclear blow first and still respond and maintain itself as a viable state. Countries like China and India are more capable of doing that. It's obviously horrific, but if Shanghai gets hit with a nuclear weapon, the People's Republic of China doesn't automatically disappear. The same with India. It can likely absorb a first strike from Pakistan or from China and respond. I do think North Korea wants a second strike capability, but posturing itself explicitly to say we will absorb a first strike before we respond doesn't quite seem right to me. So moving on. So if Narang's postures don't quite seem to fit, then maybe North Korea is doing something that we haven't seen in other nuclear states. And so my colleague and I, sort of just starting on this, going through the theory part, thinking, well, maybe we need to first start and ask, is the nuclear state, are we talking about a status quo power or a revisionist power? And we would say that a revisionist power is going to adopt a compellent posture versus a status quo goes for a deterrent posture. I think North Korea sees itself as a revisionist state. I would say of the two Koreas, North Korea is the one not satisfied with the status quo. I think South Korea, certainly there are issues, but for the most part satisfied with the status quo. North Korea, not so much. And they sort of make this clear in their rhetoric, that they want a changed situation on the Korean Peninsula. So if this is correct and they're going for a compellent posture, as I said earlier, that would suggest they're adopting a more aggressive posture and potentially a posture where they feel that they need to use these weapons, where they would issue threats, but again, at some point, if your compellence is credible, you have to actually act out your threat. So how do we go about then? If we say it's a compellent posture, but we need to do some empirics to see, does this actually work out? So this is kind of where we're at now. I look forward to your feedback on this to help us. And we're started, by looking first at the intentions. Again, that core question of, is the state satisfied with the status quo or not, or would it seek a change to the status quo? And so in that, what is the stated goal of the country's nuclear program? Do they have longer-term strategic goals that may explain what they're doing with their nuclear program? Do they have other conventional capabilities that make their nuclear weapons redundant? Do they possess nuclear capabilities that don't seem to match with their stated goals? And finally, does the state have a history of compelling in the conventional realm, so before they've got to the nuclear? But do they seem to adopt a compellant posture? So stepping through this a little bit, stated goals of the country's nuclear program. Here's the first problem for us. North Korea is fairly consistent in saying that things like this: North Korea's nuclear weapons, powerful deterrent, firmly safeguarding the peace and security in the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, referring to protracted nuclear threats of the US imperialists. I'm sure somewhere in here was hostile policy. That always gets mentioned, US hostile policy. But they stick pretty well to saying it's a deterrent. I find this addition, security in Korea and Northeast Asia, is interesting. as if they're taking credit for creating peace and security in the region. I don't know how many of you would agree with that. My gut feeling is that not many others would agree with that. But North Korea has also said this to South Koreans, of saying that our nuclear weapons will protect you from the US imperialists. As if they're trying to win favor of the South Koreans by saying this. I'm not sure that message goes over too well in South Korea, but that's what they say. So if they say it's a deterrent, is it just a deterrent? Well, let's go through the other questions here. What is North Korea's long-term goals? Another thing that they're pretty consistent talking about is reunification. Now, I don't know how serious they actually are on it. Fortunately, Kim Jong-un doesn't tweet, so we don't get that direct line into his thinking, as some other leaders tweet more often. So we don't know that. But North Korea is pretty consistent in saying that they are pursuing reunification. Much more so than South Korea. South Korea doesn't put reunification necessarily at the top of its stated goals. It's there. But I think if you ask most South Koreans, reunification is somewhere further down the list of what they want to pursue. North Korea also, both explicitly, I think a few years ago in their New Year's address, they mentioned about getting the US imperialists out of South Korea. But they're pretty consistent, be it explicitly or implicitly, in saying what they want is the United States out of Korea. And that we will pursue reunification, or we will pursue whatever resolution of the inter-Korean conflict between ourselves. 우리 민족끼리. We will do it among our people. They have been very consistent with this throughout their history. So this looks like a longer-term goal for them. And if you go back to joint declarations between North and South Korea, say from 1972, from 2000, 2007, they usually reference this type of thing. We will pursue independent reunification, free of any foreign influence. We will do it amongst ourselves. So maybe they're trying to actually do this, or at least try to get the US out of Korean affairs, and they can resolve whatever inter-Korean conflict there is, just among Korean people. Do they have redundant capabilities? If they're just trying to deter a US invasion, do they have conventional capabilities that do that? Well, the US has been positioned in South Korea since 1950, and there has been no invasion of North Korea. And a big reason for this, and importantly, there's not just been an invasion by the US, but there's been no invasion by South Korea, despite some pretty clear intentions from Lee Seung-man, the first South Korean president, Park Chung-hee, afterward, of being interested in pursuing reunification. The US, though, consistently tried to hold that back and saying, well, we're not interested in reunification by force. And partly because any conflict that breaks out in Korea, we think puts Seoul at immediate risk. And that Seoul is in range of long-range artillery and in short-range rockets. And that North Korea could level pretty good destruction and death on Seoul before the conflict could be terminated. So I think in that sense, North Korea has had a fairly strong conventional deterrence posture against the US and South Korea throughout its history. So what is its nuclear weapons adding to it? Now certainly, North Korea brings up the examples of Libya and Iraq and saying, oh, states that don't have nuclear weapons get invaded by the United States. And I think they're serious about that. And I think they're serious in fearing the US military and fearing what the US military could do. But that being said, the historical record has been that the US prefers de-escalation and return to status quo on the Korean Peninsula, not pursuing conflict further to try and topple North Korea. And that was before North Korea acquired nuclear weapons. So again, I would ask, what are these nuclear weapons trying to do if they've had a strong conventional deterrent posture? Do they have capabilities that seem to be not in line with stated goals? If they're trying to deter a US invasion, what do ICBMs do for them? Well, it puts the US mainland in play. It puts the US populace in play. But is that a deterrent posture or a compellent to try and convince Americans that it's not worth it to be in Korea? In my opinion, North Korea doesn't need to hit Washington, D.C. in order to deter US invasion. And finally, does the country have a history of using compellents? Well, this is kind of reaching into history well before North Korea had nuclear weapons. But a famous example of North Korean acting on compellent threats was in the late 1960s. While the US was heavily involved in Vietnam, and South Korea was too. After the US, South Korea had the second highest military contingent in Vietnam supporting US operations. So Kim Il-sung saw this and thought, I'm going to test that alliance and test how committed the United States is to South Korea, or even how committed is South Korea to staying with the United States. So they conducted a lot of low-level attacks. Looking back, to me, this is almost unthinkable. In a 4-year period, 75 US soldiers were killed in combat along the DMZ. 75. Doesn't sound necessarily like a lot, but the last US troop to die in combat in Korea was 1994, when a US helicopter strayed over the DMZ, strayed into North Korean airspace and was shot down. And one of the crewmen on that helicopter died. I was 15 in 1994. I'm not sure I knew what Korea was at that point in my life. So the idea of US soldiers dying in combat in Korea almost seems unthinkable to me. So this is quite stunning. And we were taking these blows while being heavily involved in Vietnam. North Korea upped the ante a bit in '68, conducting a raid on the South Korean president's residence, the Blue House, in an attempted assassination. Also seizing the USS Pueblo, which remains docked in Pyongyang. There was also a US spy plane that was shot down. So pretty high-level provocations. It, to me, again, almost seems unthinkable of attempted assassination on the South Korean president today. North Korea has a history of trying this at least 3 times. Not being successful in any of them, but trying. So they have a history of having a strategy that uses violence to try and convince the US to withdraw or to back down in its commitment from South Korea, or to try and drive, as they say, a wedge between the US and South Korea and decouple the allies. This is an example of testing the US-South Korea alliance. North Korea's ballistic missiles and a compellent threat could do this between the US and Japan now. And Japan has been in range since 1998. So in a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, the US expects that it can use bases in Japan as rear support, as it did during the Korean War. It can bring in forces from Okinawa and elsewhere. It can use the bases here for logistical and supply support. But North Korea could issue a threat saying, Japan, if you allow that to be used, you could be attacked with our nuclear weapons. This is sort of the ultimate blackmail scenario for the US-Japan alliance, of telling Japan basically to choose, do you want to be attacked with nuclear weapons or keep the alliance? We can maybe talk about that in the Q&A of how that could play out. But for Japanese security officials, this is quite a troubling situation now. But North Korea seems to have a history of being willing to use violence to really test these alliances. And publicly, both Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, they, I think strikingly for a nuclear state, they talk about their nuclear weapons a lot in their media, much more than any other nuclear state does, explicitly saying about their nuclear weapons and about their capability. Certainly the US presidents, both the current president, President Obama, President Bush before him, have made veiled threats, deterrent threats of, if North Korea attacks the U.S., we have the capability to respond overwhelmingly, or we could destroy North Korea. North Korea's term of art is Sea of Fire, but they in general use their nuclear threat, and they'll say, our nuclear deterrent will be used to stop the U.S. aggressors, imperialists, whatever they say, but they mention this a lot. Or they release videos showing the U.S. burning to the ground and people dreaming about it. And it's the glory of the country to have brought the imperialists to the ground. This is much more violent imagery than other nuclear states use. I would suggest that this is another sign of them using compellents, that they're issuing nuclear threats. Yes, they are consistent in saying nuclear deterrence, but I think the sheer frequency and sort of violence that they show in their nuclear statements are maybe more compelling than deterring. Because again, if you go back to thinking on what makes a deterrent threat credible, I don't think anyone questions that, okay, if we just unprovoked attack North Korea, they will of course respond with all they have. That seems credible. Having to keep bringing that up seems a bit odd. So why may they be going for a compellent posture? Well, generally, just trying to seek bargaining advantage. So that means whatever their goals are, they probably want to relieve whatever pressure they feel on the regime, be it economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, adversarial military forces on its border. They want to relieve that pressure first. And so they can do that by driving a wedge in the alliance to try and break one side or the other, whoever decides to back down, South Korea or the US or Japan. But to keep doing this, they have to keep raising the threshold. They can't just keep saying, oh, we'll use small arms, or we'll use small target attacks along the DMZ. Those haven't driven a wedge in the past. Doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't work in the future, but it hasn't worked in the past. So that I think they could think we need to keep upping this and find the level of pain that is intolerable to one side. Now, nuclear-tipped ICBMs, sort of shockingly for the US, brings the populace into play. I don't know if you've heard about Hawaii taking measures to try and counter a North Korean nuclear attack, or states in the West Coast talking about it. To me, it's just kind of, unthinkable. But I think, again, it's North Korea working on the psychology of Americans, of telling them that, yes, us, North Korea, can threaten you, that we can reach out and hit you. And some Americans are reacting maybe irrationally, but again, this is not necessarily rational, of thinking that this country can threaten the United States. And maybe then North Korea would initiate conflict in order to gain leverage. Because say if they initiate a conflict and issue a nuclear threat, and the US says, okay, let's stop, de-escalate, return to status quo. That could be viewed then by South Koreans as the US backed down in the face of a North Korean nuclear threat. That doesn't necessarily endear confidence in South Koreans in the US will to defend it. And North Korea has pushed for a peace treaty. I'm sure you know the Korean War ended in an armistice that was not signed by South Korea. It was signed by the UN command, and the UN commander at the time was a US general. So North Korea says it wants a peace treaty with the United States. So maybe it could issue a compellent threat to try and get a peace treaty signed. But the signing of a peace treaty means that the UN command in South Korea is no longer necessary, that the Armistice Commission is no longer necessary. And if we don't have a UN command there, what are US troops doing there? I could see this as a sort of gradual erosion or eating into the US-South Korea alliance. Maybe even with the goal of withdrawing from South Korea. So this suggests that maybe there's a range of postures other than deterrence. And while we haven't seen it necessarily in the past, North Korea may be the first example of a nuclear state posturing to compel. So obviously, I presented just a very simple, maybe they're trying to compel, but we need to now explore more of how exactly could they do that, and what does the range of compellent postures look like? And if we can sort of figure out what that range of compellent postures look like, we can better figure out how to address it and how to counter it. And one thing I'm starting to work on now is sort of a discourse analysis on North Korean rhetoric to see what we can say. Let me go quickly through domestic debate in South Korea and Japan. So how are people in South Korea and Japan or the governments responding to this? There is strong support here in Japan for the US security alliance. North Korea's nuclear program is viewed as a threat. And in general, last month Abe called the election. He tried to make North Korea an election issue. I don't think that's what people necessarily voted on, but support for Abe's approach of strengthening the alliance with the US is generally supported, despite some skepticism of the current US president. Sort of similar in South Korea, support for the alliance is strong. Belief in the current US president, not quite as strong. But I think this is striking. When asked, South Koreans view nuclear tests by North Korea as threatening. But since 2007, there's been a gradual decline in belief that North Korea could start a war, to the point where, after the most recent test, only 35% North Korea said that North Korea is likely to start a war. There's sort of a normalization in South Korea of living with North Korea's nuclear program. And their threat perception is going down. I don't think this is surprising, since South Koreans have lived with a North Korean threat for decades. But again, pretty strong support for the alliance. Moon Jae-in also has a very high support. His approval rating has been above 75% so far. It's the highest of any Korean president since the early 90s with Kim Young-sam. Although if he's like every other South Korean president in history, his support will gradually decline over time to where he gets, about 20% at the end of his term. Or Kim Young-sam took a fall from like 85% down to 5%. It's amazing. He has the peak and the valley. Could Japan or South Korea pursue nuclear weapons themselves? I don't think there's any support for it here in Japan. There's no command and control for it. There's no calls for deploying US nuclear weapons here. There have been calls by some South Koreans, be it in the opposition party. Apparently the defense minister brought it up with US Defense Secretary Mattis. And polling says that South Koreans say like 50 to 60% say they want their own nuclear weapons. But I think if you drill down in that polling and said, okay, if you got nukes, what if it meant the end of the US alliance? Or what if it meant severe economic sanctioning? What if it meant you don't get your iPhone anymore? Support for nuclear weapons may drop at that point. And I think there's a lot of constraints on the two countries. Both technically, they may have some civilian nuclear technology, but there's really no concept of command and control in using these weapons in Japan and South Korea. And also, there's a lot of domestic factors, as some scholars have brought up, that both of them need international markets. These are export-driven economies. Developing nuclear weapons would threaten those international linkages. Oh, C2, I'm sorry. That is command and control. Yeah. What's that? Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm sorry. Too many acronyms on this slide. I didn't un-DOD this. So that means enrichment and reprocessing. The two technologies used for making fissile material for nuclear weapons or civilian nuclear fuel. I also think Jacques Hymans has developed the idea of veto players. And so players in society that can say no. Be it you have democracy, so you have political parties that could say no. private industry that could say no, civil society that could say no. I think both Japan and South Korea have developed more of those over time that would oppose a nuclear weapons program, and that could potentially stop it. So I don't really see nuclear breakout anytime soon in Japan and South Korea. But past doesn't necessarily mean precedents. I mean, as the North Korean nuclear threat grows, or if US posture in the region changes, a lot of this could be rethought. So what does this mean? If North Korea has adopted a compellent posture, I think in general it means that North Korea will be more aggressive. The problem becomes more time sensitive because they may feel that they need to make their compellent threats credible. So we need to act on it to counter it. And the US messaging to the allies, I think, becomes more critical. Of maintaining that assurance among our allies becomes more important. A sort of a deterrence by denial method of denying North Korea its goal of decoupling the US from Japan and South Korea. And we also need to be very careful, though, about initiating conflict, about doing things that could start a conflict, because that might be what North Korea wants. That at the beginning of a conflict, they issue a nuclear threat and see how the US handles it. So finally, I kind of said this, but really, our messaging on the alliances has to be very strong. And bolstering public support for this is critical to maintain the alliances, unless, of course, both parties agree that they no longer want the alliances. Obviously, things like regional ballistic missile defense, again, another acronym, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Ballistic missile defense depends on this because you need to be able to find and track any missiles coming toward Japan or South Korea in order to knock those missiles out of the sky. And a big bugaboo, of course, is Japan-South Korea relations. I think Moon's continuing of Jisomia, basically they're going to share intelligence on North Korea. It's a year-by-year thing. Moon, Jaein has not canceled it. So I think that was an encouraging move. I think it'd be good if that becomes more institutionalized and more routinized in their relationship. Clarifying the role of Japan in contingencies on Korea, making it clear what Japan would and would not do to try and build some more confidence in South Korea. And finally, history issues and territorial disputes won't just go away. Japan and South Korea have a history of when crisis hits, particularly in humanitarian assistance disaster, they can cooperate. But that doesn't mean that disputes over history issues will go away. Those will remain and need to be addressed in order to actually improve relations. So with that, I will end. Look forward to your questions. Kyle, I don't know how you want to handle this.
I'll just ask one question and then open it up to the floor. Jim, what do you think North Korea's next move is? We had talked a little about this previously when you guest lectured my class this afternoon. There's some concern that they might do an open-air atomic bomb test, perhaps even a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific, which wouldn't be a direct attack upon the mainland, but would be a form of escalation. Do you think that's possible? Is it likely?
Well, North Korea has publicly stated that it's possible. That they said that they could do it, and then a little bit later they said, don't discount this threat. That maybe we think that's what we have to do. So it is possible. I don't think it's a high possibility because it is quite a provocative action, much more provocative than its underground nuclear testing, particularly if they do a thermonuclear detonation. I don't know exactly what a U.S. or allied response would be to that. I'm not sure we would necessarily go towards military action, but it certainly would provoke a strong response from the region. And North Korea, in its history, has been very good about sort of prodding and finding where the line is, what they can't do, or what is too provocative. So they might be exploring that line right now. If they say, okay, we could do an atmospheric test of a thermonuclear weapon. See what is the response from the US and Japan and South Korea. If the response is not very strong, maybe that increases the likelihood that they maybe would do it. I see no technical reason for them to have to do that. In order for proving their weapons, they can do that with all underground testing. Underground testing can also preserve some of the ambiguity over their capabilities. It would be very embarrassing for them if they did an atmospheric test and it failed. And then everyone can go collect data on this failed test and see what was wrong, or maybe try and find out what are their designs. If you release all of the radiation from the test, it's easier to figure out what the bomb was made of. So at this point, I don't really see some sort of real strong motivation for them to do it. I think it's more probing to see what can they get away with in their nuclear posture.
Of course, the other side of this equation is what the United States under President Trump and their strategies are. It struck me as really interesting that one of your last slides where you talked about policy implications, you had 6 or 8 items, and every single one of them seemed to be contrary to what President Trump has projected for the last several months.
Okay. Well, yeah. This is my own opinion, by the way. I'm going back to that disclaimer.
Turn the video off.
No. But, certainly during the campaign, President Trump said some unsettling things for alliance relations, talking about burden sharing, increasing the burden sharing here in Japan and South Korea, even just overall questioning the value of the alliance. Why are we in Japan and South Korea? These are wealthy countries that can defend themselves. Why are we there? As a candidate, this is unsettling enough. But since he's become president, he has not repeated that sort of messaging. And he's been softer on these bilateral alliances in Asia than he has been on Europe. When he visited Brussels, he sort of lectured at NATO, told them they need to spend more, do more, all that. When he came here to Asia, he did not repeat that type of message. I also think in general the administration has done a pretty good job. Say it's Secretary Mattis, Vice President Pence, and other officials that travel through the region of sort of saying the right thing. The only thing I would be a little concerned about is what Trump and Vice President Pence have said about the CUWS FTA, the Korea-United States Free Trade Agreement. Sort of maybe suggesting we could renegotiate that, which South Korea is definitely not interested in doing. And certainly pulling out of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was not a welcome move here in Tokyo and in other capitals in the region. But Japan has, I think, sort of absorbed that blow, and the Abe administration, I think, sees no other viable choice other than to maintain the alliance. Ballistic missile defense, the THAAD battery in South Korea was deployed. And Moon Jae-in said that he is going to continue with South Korea's ballistic missile defense development. Now, diplomatic initiatives, we have an ambassador here in Tokyo. We do not have an ambassador yet in Seoul. I think that's a problem. We don't have other diplomatic or posts in the State Department for deputy secretaries and assistant secretaries. That's an issue. But on the sort of core military alliance front, I do think the messaging has gotten better since Trump became president. But I went through it quickly, but the polling, particularly in South Korea, that shows this stark contrast between confidence in the US, belief in the alliance, being suspicious of President Trump. I think that's a dynamic that can't last. That eventually, not believing President Trump will erode US credibility. So I think the administration has to work hard on that. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but certainly that sort of dynamic needs to change. I don't know if you had anything else in mind,
No.
particularly
No.
going against this.
Very
Trump
interesting.
also has at least had a nice picture show of having Moon Jae-in and Abe meet. And they didn't fight each other. So, I mean, it looked like a nice show when they met. So I would say Japan-South Korea relations haven't necessarily degraded significantly under the Trump administration, but that being said, I don't know if he's really focused on, say, helping resolve history issues or other diplomatic disputes between Japan and South Korea. But maybe the administration also views that as not their role.
Everyone, you're welcome to ask questions. You need to come up to the mic, and you can just queue up. You don't need to wait to be called on. Please note that we are videotaping this, and we will publish it up on our YouTube channel. So if you speak, you're going to be on tape. So please, if you could keep your questions brief.
And if you don't mind, for my own curiosity, if you could maybe identify who you are and where you're from. Just be curious who's here. This guy, no. By the way, it's very nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. It's really wonderful to be back and engage with old and new friends.
Father Paul Korlup, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate, and a University of Michigan alumnus. Go Blue.
Go Blue.
On the subject of alliances and U.S. credibility, several years after regaining independence in the 1990s, under great pressure from the United States, Ukraine became, after South Africa, only the second country to voluntarily give away its nuclear capabilities. It signed the Budapest Memorandum in which England, the United States, and believe it or not, Russia, agreed to forever guarantee the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Since 2014, there's been some question about how useful that agreement was. A country like North Korea or other potential or current nuclear powers, looking at what happened to a country like Ukraine, what lessons might they learn from that, and what might the United States or other countries do to make giving up nuclear weapons a positive a choice?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think anyone who studies alliance dynamics realizes that these alliances don't exist in a vacuum. That what the U.S. does with South Korea is watch very carefully here in Tokyo. What we do in Brussels with NATO is watch very closely here in the region. So certainly what the U.S. has done with the crisis in Ukraine is watched by people here in Asia. And how the U.S. or NATO or whoever responds to that is watched very carefully. So I would say on the U.S. alliance part of that, certainly Ukraine is not in NATO. This is an important distinction. But how we sort of manage how Russia really picked off sovereign Ukrainian territory without any sort of military response to it, in one hand could be encouraging to a country like North Korea, that it can eat away without suffering significant consequences. But again, I would say it's very simple, but the U.S. standing strong with its alliance partners here in Asia helps to deny North Korea from achieving such objective. The second thing about creating a norm or an incentive to give up nuclear weapons, I think in general in the world there is that norm. There is a nuclear taboo. There is a taboo against use. There is a taboo against the development of nuclear weapons. In general, North Korea rejects these. They say that we are under constant threat, and it is our sovereign right to defend ourselves, so thus we need nuclear weapons. And you look at what happens to countries that don't have nuclear weapons. Now, they typically will bring up Libya and Iraq because the U.S. invaded those countries. U.S.-led coalition forces. The Ukraine, they don't bring up. They might have. I would have to dig into their rhetoric on what they've said about it. But Russia invading another country isn't as relevant to them as the US invading another country. But North Korea also has been very, very, very clear that they are not interested in denuclearization. They will consistently emphasize this. They put it in the bedrock of the state, in the Constitution. So as far as creating sort of a norm that they shouldn't have these weapons, well, that's told to them repeatedly. And I think they reject that. And maybe they view it as their right to do that. Short of the US withdrawing from South Korea and dismantling its own nuclear weapons, I'm not sure what the US could do to gain North Korea's trust to denuclearize. And I think for an American, this is one thing that is maybe hard to understand, is the level of distrust that North Koreans have for the United States. And I would say it sort of goes both ways. That I don't think North Koreans have a good perspective on what the US intentions are, but I don't think we have a real good view of how North Koreans do not trust the United States at all. This hampers any sort of diplomatic initiative between the two. And if any sort of US-led initiative of saying, oh, we should get rid of nukes are bad, we should do that, but we maintain our nuclear weapons, North Korea can point to that as, oh, that's hypocritical, you have nukes, so we should have them too. So short of the US denuclearizing or getting out of Asia, I don't think there's much that could be done. Well, thank you for the question. I mean, certainly that's a path we could go down if we choose, but I'm not sure the US domestically is interested in doing that right now. Right. Yes, sir.
I'm a retired old man from financial services. My question is this. As I read some of the writings by Japanese Defense Forces personnel, they indicate that the only realistic way for Japan to go nuclear is to enter into a so-called nuclear sharing arrangement, as Germany actually has with the United States. I actually would not be so surprised if President Trump approves such arrangement, but purely from Pentagon's point of view, you think that's could happen if Japanese government makes such a request?
Well, so the first thing I would say is, well, thank you for your question, sir.
I hope I made myself clear.
Yeah, no, I understand. You can sit down if you want. But there is a nuclear posture review going on right now in the United States. Should be out soon. I don't know when. I'm not involved in it, so I don't know. Even if I knew, I wouldn't be able to say, but I don't know what is in the content of that review. I think it's safe to say that there could be some, at least significant rhetorical changes in the next nuclear posture review, but we'll have to wait and see on that. As far as a nuclear sharing agreement, if you mean deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan, okay. Yeah, so I want to just kind of touch on both. If you mean, as some of the South Koreans have asked, for reintroduction of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons on the ground, that is you reuse the word, that is sort of a tactical nightmare because there are no nuclear storage depots here in Japan. Building those would be incredibly expensive, and guarding them and maintaining them would be a logistical challenge. The U.S. also does not have these tactical systems to deploy right now. We would have to rebuild those into the nuclear stockpile. That would be a very long and costly process. So even if Japan asked today and the U.S. approved it tomorrow, maybe in 10 years we can get you something. Because anyone who works for the governments knows how fast acquisitions go. And also then, that also means even if Trump would approve it, he might not be in office at the point where we would actually want to deploy it, just by the long time it would take to acquire the new systems. But as far as then the surface ships, again, we don't have the TLAM-N, the Tomahawk land attack missiles, the nuclear-capable cruise missiles, were removed from surface ships in the early 90s under the George H.W. Bush administration and dismantled. They're gone. So we don't have those systems to redeploy. They would have to, again, be developed anew. So given all that, I think from a practical standpoint, I would be very surprised if the U.S. would pursue such a thing, because it would be costly and take a long time. Certainly the president could decide to do it, but it would be a long time before they actually could come into service. But the U.S. stance has been that we don't need those tactical systems. We don't need them deployed here in the region, because strategic systems can be brought to the region quickly. And the U.S. tries to demonstrate that with its B-52s based in Guam. And so say we can bring the bombers here quickly. The bombers can come from the mainland pretty quickly too, be it B-52s or B-2s. Obviously ballistic missiles can get here quickly too, the ICBMs. But that is the U.S. response, that we have strategic systems that can be brought quickly. Thus, we don't need to develop and deploy new tactical systems. I also think there's concern in the U.S., at least in previous administrations, that redeployment of tactical systems increases the chance that they would get used. That if we have them in the region, and if launch authority is given to the field officers, you're more likely to see use. Still low, but higher than if you're just relying on strategic systems. So that's a long-winded answer of saying, I don't know for sure, but I would be shocked if the U.S. agreed to any sort of nuclear sharing with Japan, or really any tactical nuclear deployment in the region. Thank you. I hope that answers.
There's 3 questions.
So, that's the cheap answer is that's an arrangement we have in Europe. And that doesn't seem to be an arrangement that the U.S. is interested in replicating here. Again, by saying that we have strategic systems that can be brought to the region quickly. And another argument against any sort of nuclear sharing is that weapons that are brought here become a target for North Korean nuclear weapons. And so if we have them at a distance, that assures the retaliation capability. Being brought here makes them vulnerable to North Korean strike. So, yeah, sir.
Jim, Peter Yeager, long-term Tokyo resident, independent at the moment. Sorry about the voice. Jim, in your analysis of regional nuclear powers and looking at their behaviors to figure out if their strategy is compellent or deterrent, one of the premises is that you look at them as nations, obviously. Now, I would say to a very great extent, most of those, obviously France, Israel, most of them are legitimate nations. But I would say the biggest difference is that North Korea is not really functioning as a legitimate nation. It's more a plutocracy, the Kim dynasty controlling the country. And therefore, when you ascribe national goals, national strategic goals to North Korea, the way you might ascribe them to France, I think it can be a bit of a fallacy that actually, in my view, and I'd like to know your view on this, I think the goal of Kim Jong-un is the preservation of the Kim dynasty at any cost, and the preservation of his great lifestyle and all his perks. And I think he's very averse to doing anything that would ever really stop that and end it. Therefore, I say it's all brinksmanship, posturing, provocations for business, to get money, to get the sanctions put down, to sell arms to the Middle East, to continue basically a revenue stream. And therefore, rather than it being a national strategic goal, it's really more, the mafia don perpetuating his own wealth. And therefore, I think the behaviors would never really go toward anything that would get him rubbed out. And I hope I'm right, If you think I'm completely naive or if I've got it wrong, I'd really like to hear your view. I'll sit down, no rebuttals.
Okay. Well, thanks. I agree with much of what you said. Certainly, the North Korean regime is a personality, is a family-driven one, which makes its decision-making processes and its goals different than France or even China. But that being said, like one thing you mentioned about wanting to maintain a revenue stream and sanctions relief. Well, I would put that as potentially one of their bargaining space that they maybe want to get out of their nuclear program. That if they can increase that potential pain to the United States, that maybe we would say, okay, that's enough. We don't want to push this farther. We'll start sanctions relief, at least what the U.S. can do. Now that's not the response the current administration is taking. I don't know if you saw the news today of North Korea Trump recommending North Korea be re-added to the state sponsors of terrorism list, which will then incur more financial sanctions measures from the U.S. Treasury. And certainly the Kim regime, Kim dynasty wants to preserve that. I mean, they want to preserve each individual leader, and they also want to preserve that dynastic line. But that's where I also think that North Korea, in their history, all three leaders have been pretty good at trying to poke and see where that line is, of what they can't cross. It's been a pretty aggressive regime in its history. Things like attempted assassinations on the Korean presidents. But they haven't done since 1983, at least not that I know of. But that's pretty provocative. But it didn't mean the end of their regime. So I think even within this space of where they think they can go, there's a lot of compelling that they can do in that. Whether they want sanctions relief or they maybe think they can get a combined exercise pause between, say, the U.S. and South Korea. Well, that would be a big win for them. Doesn't mean they're going to get reunification immediately after, but that's a big relief for them. Because again, I think also as an American, it's hard to understand how much the threat perception from North Korea, that their perception of the threat from the United States. So relieving pressure from that threat, I think, could be an important goal. Not necessarily that they're pursuing regime change or trying to attack the United States, but whatever they think is relief of that pressure, which their nuclear weapons, they could have no true intentions to use them. But if they think that a particular U.S. leader, a particular South Korean leader will back down and say, okay, well, we want to de-escalate tensions here. And that could be a way that, the Kim regime could see as persisting itself. But I think the Kim dynasty also views an inherent instability. The existence of South Korea presents an existential threat to them, that it's an alternative Korea that is much more prosperous, is much more respected on the world stage. They try to portray it as, it's an occupied country and it's impure and all that, and we're the pure Korea. But they know the power of South Korean soft power. They realize that on their own populace. So that too, if they can get space away from them, that can be viewed as being able to persist their regime. And also, as far as any talk of reunification or anything, I think they know that no one outside of Pyongyang talks about reunifying under DPRK. Reunification or confederation or whatever you want to call it between the two essentially means the end of DPRK. So the ROC government would not accept any sort of influence from the Kim dynasty. So I do think they have space to use nuclear weapons to try and compel, even if they have no true intention of actually using them. Because they know that. They know that using them first is going to be probably the end of them. So I don't know, does that help answer? Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sir.
All right.
My name is Juan Carlos. I'm a second-year transfer student here
Okay.
from
Excellent.
Jacksonville, Florida. Come from a military family, but I've never served myself. Okay, so here at the school, I represent an anti-imperialist, anti-war group. We're just forming. So I'm here representing that group. I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Can I just two?
Okay,
So-
please. Yeah.
All right. So first, we want to go over the fact that there's a military option. Like, this has come up a lot in U.S. foreign policy. Is there a first strike or a preemptive strike military option? Steve Bannon, before he was removed from his post in the White House, he was interviewed and he said there's absolutely no military option, like in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
The first day you got hundreds of thousands to millions dead.
Sure.
But he was removed, and the generals that surround Trump, were saying, well, not so fast. Like, it's, we have to keep all options on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So for us students, young people, this is a pretty scary thing that's happening. We're trying to look at this as objectively as possible to get a hold on what's happening. So we started with the Korean War, go back to the 50s. And in North Korea, 20% of the North Korean population was eliminated in that war, and every single city was leveled by the U.S. military. So, like, we understand, the fear that the North Koreans have, the regime, has against the U.S. And also to go into the Middle East, to expand outside of the region. Since I was in grade school and elementary school, the U.S. has been at war in the Middle East, and this war has expanded from just Iraq and Afghanistan to Syria and to Africa now. And with recent revelations, in Nigeria, we find that the U.S. has been operating secretly, increasingly in Africa for the last decade at least. So what is this, like, how would you respond to, the actual allegations against the U.S.? Would you characterize it as imperialist
Okay.
in that regard?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Professor Cleveland's the real imperialist here. I'm sorry about that. But I'm glad to address that. Maybe I can take a question from behind, and we can maybe. Sure. Okay, so military option. Is there a military option? The U.S. Is certainly capable of conducting military options on North Korea. I don't think that there is serious intent by the United States to conduct any sort of preemptive or preventative strikes in North Korea. The U.S. explored this in 1992. The Clinton administration explored military strikes on Yongbyon, the North Korean nuclear production facility, and eventually decided that it was too risky, that it was risking Seoul. So we did not go with military options. I think that the U.S., though, in general, does not like to say that it's limited. And I think part of this is for alliance considerations, that I think we would be concerned if we told the South Koreans we would never use military, because it is written in the alliance treaty that we will use force to defend South Korea. So in that sense, I think maybe there's a bit of a constraint where where the United States feels it formally can't go out and say that military options are off. But I think it's clear the U.S. preference has been to not use military against North Korea because of fear of the conflict getting out of control. But you brought up the memory of the Korean War and the experience of that. I again go back to what I said about the level of mistrust that North Koreans have toward the United States. That memory of the Korean War is very alive in North Korea. And it's really pushed in their education about what happened during the war to keep that memory alive. Again, not sure how much Americans appreciate that. And so when we say things like military, not all options are on the table, this brings up memories of the war. which is very, very troubling for North Koreans. But that being said, I don't see actual serious pursuit of military options, at least first strike. If there's an invasion from North Korea, we're obligated by treaty, and I think just in general, you have forces there, they would probably respond. I also, I know I kind of buzzed through these. South Korea, where is it? A majority in South Korea oppose preemptive strikes by the United States. So I think we have a feeling that, well, of course, we say we would honor the treaty obligation to defend, but we also know that South Koreans, probably along with the US population, and the South Korean president don't support preemptive strikes. So while all options may be on the table, at least the stated, I think the practice is a little bit different. So I'm sorry to cut you off. I hope that answers some of the view.
I have one major question.
Okay,
You can talk to them about the commercial.
sure. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Martin Colling. I'm with the German business daily Handelsblatt. One question, basically two-pronged question. It's about the fine line you mentioned. North Korea was very good at it in the past to basically test the United States, not to cross too much over, but to really test the red line.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned that the United States have to be careful now to provoke North Korea. And I wonder, in this regard, with today's news of relisting North Korea of terror as a state of
State sponsor of terror.
state-sponsored terrorism, whether how do you see this move in this build-up of threats and pressure on North Korea, how this will be perceived in North Korea and how North Korea might react. And the North Korean side of my question is the development of ICBMs maybe a miscalculation on their part? Do you think how do the United States see this threat? Will it make the United States more mellow, or will it make the United States actually be more aggressive and more threatening towards North Korea? And maybe North Korea really miscalculated the effect of this development.
Okay. So as far as a miscalculation, obviously we don't know yet. I mean, this is a new development, so it's hard to say. But I don't necessarily think it's a miscalculation. And I think if you, at least from the North Korean side, and if you see the U.S. response to it, well, I would say it's not a miscalculation if they're trying to compel the U.S. to back away from the region. Because they're making American citizens in places like where I live in Alabama actually fear that North Korea could attack the United States. I mean, to me, this is stunning. I try and tell people, like, I don't think you need to worry about it. You can just go on with your lives. It's fine. But the fact that people are talking about it is stunning. Now, if they're trying to compel the U.S. to disengage, this could work because if American citizens say, hey, this is now threatening my own security. So why are we in South Korea if we're sort of bringing this threat on us? Now, I don't think that the U.S. hasn't gone to that length where Americans are questioning the alliance. Support for the alliance is still strong. But that may be one goal that North Korea has for the ICBM, to get Americans to really think that North Korea is a threat. Now, the miscalculation can come if whatever president decides that, well, that's a threat we do not accept and we truly won't live with, then they may bring stronger action on them. And your other question, about the state sponsors of terrorism. Certainly North Korea will probably say something in their media about this is horrible and hostile policy and all that. But I don't think that measure alone is going to provoke some sort of, as we say in military, kinetic response, some sort of response with military force by North Korea. Probably like talk about how it's evil, but it doesn't mean that they're going to launch a nuclear weapon just because they're put back on this list. It is consistent with this administration's policy of maximum pressure. So putting them back on the state-sponsored terrorism list automatically triggers some other sanctions. North Korea also, there was a travel ban placed on them by the administration. Last year under Obama, North Korea is also named as a money laundering concern. And so that triggers sanctions under the Patriot Act. So I do think this is a gradual replacement of some of the sanctions that were there. They were on that state sponsors of terrorism list until 2007. Okay, so it's sort of a reversion back to that time.
Next question. Okay. Sadaki Nomata, retired diplomat with some experience in Japan-US alliance management. How does China come into the picture?
Oh, good question. Haven't mentioned our friends across the sea here. Yeah, I think China has come up a lot in this discussion, certainly because they're a major player in the region, and also the Trump administration has made a point of saying, well, China can put the pressure on North Korea to end this threat. That's not necessarily a new tactic. It kind of became a trope. China can do more. China can do more. Just like in the war on terror, Pakistan can do more. Not really sure what more is, but they bring it up a lot. So China, certainly, if there is a conflict, could intervene to stop the conflict. But I don't think that China's doesn't seem interested or willing to really stop this threat. I mean, whatever that means, it's a very vague statement to say, take care of the North Korea threat. But if it means really changing the nature of the DPRK through some sort of cutting off a fuel supply or that, that is asking China to do something that they're probably not willing to do, because that would be a very destabilizing move. And their preference has been for status quo and maintain that in the region. Now, I don't know if China would view this sort of strategy as potentially beneficial, if maybe decoupling the U.S. from its allies in the region, it could be something welcomed by China. But maybe it wouldn't be if they viewed it as that's potentially destabilizing in a power vacuum, Japan remilitarizes, whatever that. So I think China has been a bit just kind of watching how the new administration handles North Korea. So we'll see. Do we have time for one more? Or? Okay.
My name is Michimi Muranoshi, a professor teaching international politics at Gakushuin University, Tokyo. If there is any war between North Korea and the US, or between North Korea and the allies of the United States, the North Korea uses nuclear weapons, and at the end of the war, the North Korean regime is kept alive. In other words, if there is no possibility that the North Korea uses nuclear weapons and it survives the war, how can the North Korean threat to use nuclear weapons be credible, no matter how well it is well equipped in terms of nuclear weapons?
Well, obviously, this is a good question. It gets to the core of, any thinking on deterrence, compellent, assurance, is the credibility of the threat. Again, I think North Korea, it's possible North Korea has no true intention of using nuclear weapons. But the mere issuance of a threat, they may want to try and just put that element of fear, an element of doubt, into the minds of U.S. Of citizens or of U.S. leaders, or into South Korea or Japanese minds. So they don't necessarily have to use the nuclear weapons in order to get some sort of compellent effect out of it simply by having that capability. So in that sense, I mean, they could have a conflict, that's conventional, issue a nuclear threat, and if the US moves to stop it, they could view that as a successful use of their nuclear weapons. By looking like the US backs down in the face of a potential nuclear threat. And nobody knows how credible they are. But the mere fact that it's possible starts to play in the psychology of your adversarial's decision makers. Okay, I know we gotta.
Jim, thank you very much. This is so interesting. I appreciate this.